Hello, everyone. My name is John McKay, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Scarborough-Guildwood, and it's my treat today to talk to Dr. Jeffrey Schiffer, who is the Executive Director of Native Child and Family Services. He's literally just moved into the neighborhood, or Native Child has just moved into the neighborhood, and they're occupying the unit next door to my office. So I thought it was kind of a good idea if we got to know our neighbors and find out a bit about what they're going to be doing in the neighborhood. Dr. Schiffer, welcome to the podcast. May I call you Jeffrey?
Yes, please do. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Jeffrey, I really appreciate you making yourself available. So you're an interesting dude. We've met before. We've talked a bit before. You do have a major failing, though, and that is you were not born in Scarborough.
Very true. Very true.
Because, there's only two kinds of people in this world. There's people who are born in Scarborough and people who wish they were born in Scarborough. So, but I see that over your adult life, you're starting to come closer to the center of the universe. So that's always good. That's always good. So.
We are
So, Jeffrey, now that we've established you're not born in Scarborough, where were you born?
So I was actually born and raised in unceded Coast Salish territory in what is today known as Vancouver, British Columbia. Mount Pleasant, not too far from City Hall in Vancouver.
Really? Oh, okay. And most people who are born have parents. Tell us about your mom and dad.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So my mother is a woman named Shirley Turcott. She's a Métis person. She was born and raised outside of Winnipeg, actually. That's the Indigenous connection in my family. She's an interesting woman. My parents actually met in the city of Toronto. I'm not sure that it was Scarborough, but met in Toronto. And my mother, had a very dynamic childhood. In fact, in 1986, the National Film Board of Canada made a documentary on my mom's life story called To a Safer Place. And really, it's about her childhood surviving physical and sexual abuse at the hands of her father, in fact. So she grew up in a very complicated home. And it led her to develop her own system of Indigenous psychotherapy, which really has informed a lot of the work that I do around reconciliation and decolonization and working with Indigenous people. My dad was actually born in Germany. He immigrated to Toronto in the 50s and grew up here in Toronto, where he met my mother. And ultimately, they settled in Vancouver, which is where I was born. My dad grew up on a farm. He was a builder, a lover of ecology. So I spent a lot of time outside with my dad in that part of the world, playing in tidal pools and learning about ecology. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're a pretty serious academic. You did your undergrad at UBC and your postgrad or graduate degrees at Columbia. So who gives you the love of learning?
Yeah, I think I take some of that from both of my parents. And it's interesting because, both my parents grew up on farms. Neither one of them completed post-secondary education. They both grew up at a time where they kind of made their careers on their own. And from both the perspectives that I gleaned from my parents, I just became very interested in Canada and very interested in Indigenous peoples and wanting to, learn about how we can live together better. And I remember I took some time off after high school, but I went back and I fell in love with cultural anthropology, just happenstance. And I think it was that love for learning about cultural reproduction and learning about Canada that led me ultimately to go all the way up to the PhD level.
Cultural reproduction. I don't know what that means.
It's funny. I came here initially to work at the City of Toronto, and I loved the time that I spent at the city as the Indigenous Affairs consultant. One of the things that I was asked to do there was to create the Indigenous Cultural Competency Training for the City of Toronto. And, I would sit in this room, and it took me about 4 months to develop the curriculum, and I would talk to, the directors from various divisions across the city, and I would say, how many of you people were here in 1834 when the Toronto Public Service was incorporated? And they would all sort of laugh. And I would say, right, none of you were here when this massive bureaucracy started, right? But you came into it, right? You came into a system of bureaucracy and policy and procedure that was created long before you, right? So all of us as Canadians, we were born into a world that is shaped by decades and decades of colonization. We can't necessarily hold ourselves account for all of that history, but we do need to understand the way that we reproduce the cultural systems in which we live as human beings, right? And public servants do that in the city of Toronto. Our federal colleagues do that. And I'm doing that right now in the context of child welfare. And the question that I asked those directors at the city of Toronto, I said, given our role in reproducing such important structures, for the city of Toronto, we need to ask ourselves, do we just want to replicate the status quo? Because it's very easy to do that, right? Or do we want to innovate? Do we want to change things, right? And I know that I want to innovate. I want to change. And for me, the type of innovation I'm interested in is decolonization and indigenization and how we change systems to better reflect and support Indigenous people.
Well, these words indigenization and colonization, they tend to get batted around a lot. So give me some idea of what you mean when you say colonization, and what not so much from the standpoint of, people who are like my ancestors arrive in Canada, and obviously set up a colony. Actually, they were the ones who were being colonized because it was the British government that was colonizing.
Sure.
It does have the words, both indigenization and colonization, have meanings today, and bring backgrounds in that probably there's not a mutual understanding of those words. So give me an idea what you mean when you say those words.
Yes, gladly. No, and these are academic words, and like you said, there's many different definitions. I've come to understand them in particular ways. And living in Toronto has been amazing. Living in Eastern Canada, in fact, living where our country started in many ways, right? And when I think about the initial promise of Canada, I think after the Haudenosaunee Confederacy helped the British, win their wars and become the European victors of this part of the world, there was a promise. That the promise took shape through treaties, but there was a promise to take all of the innovation and sophistication and worldview from both European powers and Indigenous ones and bring those together to co-develop a new nation, right? And that's a beautiful dream. It's a beautiful dream, but we fell off that path, right? We broke that promise a little bit. And when you think about the structures that I was just talking about, us all being complicit in reproducing on a daily basis, most of the structures that we operate in are built, they're Eurocentric. They're built on the values and the understandings of European nations in a particular time and place, right? So decolonization rather than colonization, I think decolonization is a reflective process that requires us to just think about the world that we inhabit and the systems we reproduce, and to try to think about where and when do those structures privilege European worldviews over Indigenous ones, right? So you could be in HR at the City of Toronto, and you could be trying to hire Indigenous people, but then you realize that you're valuing people on the basis of university credentials that don't really value all of the Indigenous knowledge and experience that certain people bring to a role, right? You're thinking about it in a very particular cultural way. So decolonization encourages us to think about that and then reflect on how we can change processes to be more sensitive to and inclusive of Indigenous ways of being. So you might say, well, this candidate for the job, they need to at least have a bachelor's degree, or they have to have commensurate experience as an Indigenous person working with elders and knowledge keepers and learning certain things that apply to whatever position this is, right? So I think that I talk about decolonization as the process of recognizing where we need to make change, and indigenization as the process of actually making that change, of saying, well, okay, we're going to change these rules or guidelines or processes a little bit more to reflect Indigenous culture, if that makes sense.
Actually, it does make sense, although I'd be interested in knowing what your validation points are for that person in HR who is looking sympathetically at recognizing something that is not a degree, as some set of experiences and knowledge that is not within the parameters of both what you and I would understand to be a degree, particularly you, who has 3 of them.
Indeed.
So,
yeah.
So, back me through that. Tell me how that HR person is going to to validate and recognize those kinds of experiences?
Sure. So I think, I back up a little bit sometimes when I'm talking to HR. And first of all, it's the process of being able to even validate somebody's skill set or competencies, you have to first get them to talk about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I often would remind people at the City of Toronto that when we look at the value base, so when you go into an interview, you got to sell yourself. You got to talk about all the really amazing things that you've done and how many skills and experiences you bring to the job. And one of the first things I remind people is that humility is a really core value for almost every Indigenous culture across Turtle Island.
It works in politics as well.
It works in politics as well, I'm sure. Right, so a lot of people with a traditional upbringing that are Indigenous are not supposed to talk about how awesome they are. And so there's actually been some interesting studies and research done that shows that an Indigenous person and a non-Indigenous person with the same qualifications perform differently in an interview. And often the non-Indigenous person finds much more ease in talking about their accomplishments and how they will lend themselves to a workplace, whereas an Indigenous person is much more humble and not quite as likely to talk about their skills and experiences. But Indigenous people are great at telling stories. And if you reshape interviews in particular ways and ask people to share stories about themselves, you can get at that information. So I think the first step of decolonizing and indigenizing an interview, if you will, is to understand that the current way in which we interview people is based on a certain set of values, which presupposes that people love to talk about how great they are and what they've accomplished. To decolonize that interview process, you might make it more of a story. You might sit down, you might have a cup of tea, you might share, almost talk like we're talking now. And through that process, glean a certain skill set, learn about that individual, build a relationship, right? Indigenous people are built on relationship. And then through that, you've got to then analyze. And it's tricky because, so if I was, bringing someone on in the context of social work, they may not have a formal social work degree, but they may have spent lots of times with elders and knowledge keepers, and they may know a lot about traditional kinship structures, raising families from an Indigenous structures, ceremony around Indigenous family, and that might give them almost as much, competency within that role, if that makes sense.
So make it personal. How do you listen to that potential interviewee, as opposed to, and I'll use myself as an example, as how I would listen to that potential interviewee?
I guess I would say that listening takes practice. I remember, when I first started working in Indigenous organizations, and also almost getting mentored by particular elders. When you grow up in the Indigenous community, you'll find that you form relationships with elders and knowledge keepers, and when you do that, it's a very special thing. And you get to sit down and you get to have tea and coffee, and you just get to listen. And for me, as being someone who also has spent a lot of time in the academic world, and reading comprehension is a very particular skill set and a very particular value and process, I had to learn how to listen differently. I had to learn how to sit down and listen to stories and realize that in this story, which seemed like it maybe didn't have anything to do with what I was talking about or asking about, actually had a lesson in there, actually had some knowledge in there for me. So I try to listen in a way that is attentive to stories and looking for almost like reading between the lines, listening between the lines of a story, if you will.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah, you have an interesting teaching relationship with your mother. I can't imagine teaching with either my mother or my father. But tell me about that, because as you indicated earlier, she has had, or I suppose still does have, an extraordinary life.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. And it's funny because teaching with my mother is something that I never really thought I wanted to do or really particularly wanted to do. But I had the opportunity, in my teens and early 20s to travel around with her while she was visiting different communities and sitting in the classroom while she was teaching and learning about that. And through that process, I really began to understand intergenerational trauma from an Indigenous perspective. As someone who is visibly white, has lots of white privilege, lived a good life, has great university credentials, I've never experienced the type of trauma that my mother has. But I can feel it and I experience it intergenerationally, and that's a whole other conversation, right? Mm-hmm. But what I did learn, and I think what people in classrooms across the country told us was that they benefited from having a mother and a son who could stand up and talk about intergenerational trauma from those two vantage points, right? And so my teaching with my mom really was about learning what trauma means from an Indigenous perspective and being able to share a family story about the way trauma spills across generations for the benefit of others, right? It's not a comfortable experience or a comfortable process, but so many people in so many communities and so many places across Canada saying that it was beneficial made me kind of feel like I needed to share it to help and benefit other people.
And how does your mother look at you now? Because you move in and out of two worlds, really. You're trying to make those worlds. You're trying to reconcile those worlds, but still, you live on one side and then on the other side, then you're back on the other side. How does your mother now look at you?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that she's happy about the work that I'm doing, but also simultaneously understands how difficult Indigenous child welfare is, and we'll probably get to that in a minute. It's I think that she's very happy about the work that I do, but also concerned in some ways because it's the role that I currently have at Native Child is without question the most challenging one that I have ever had, and I think she recognizes that 100%.
So let's, for the moment, imagine that we are on Kingston Road in front of your office, and we see your sign out right beside my sign, actually. Describe Native Child to that person, and what it does, and what's its mission, and what's its values, and what's its goals.
Sure. Yeah. I like to start with our service model, and I always start by acknowledging Ken Richard, who was the founder and only other executive director at Native Child, who was with the agency for over 3 decades, and I've been very lucky to take over the stewardship of the agency. But Native Child emerged in the 80s. The agency was incorporated in 86, and it's important because that's around the time that the first generation of children were aging out of the 60s scoop. Right? We know a lot about the 60s scoop now as Canadians, but in the early 50s, we amended the Indian Act, which enabled provincial child welfare legislation to be extended onto reserve into a federal jurisdiction. And that enabled social workers for the first time to move into reserve territories and apprehend children. And we saw a massive apprehension. And, as quickly as residential schools were closing, provincial systems of child welfare were emerging, and lots of kids were taken. I have family members that were taken in the 60 scoop. My mother was in the system. And those kids started aging out, and they flooded into the Toronto streets. They were up and down Yonge Street. They were in Scarborough, and a group of elders, knowledge keepers, and community advocates came together in the city of Toronto and said, we need an organization to support Indigenous children and families. We need an organization to address the aftermath of colonization that we're seeing on a daily basis on our streets. And so they came together in ceremony as Indigenous people do. And after 4 days of ceremony and fasting and sweating, they developed the service model of Native Child. It's a sacred service model, which basically says that to address the issues that Indigenous children and families are facing in the city of Toronto, we need an organization that recognizes people holistically, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and that wraps families and children and youth in holistic services, not only to reduce the probability that they will enter child welfare or reduce the time they're in child welfare, but really to create concrete pathways to wellness and prosperity for them. And so for almost 20 years, our agency was just a prevention agency. We started as a prevention agency doing support services, clinical services, youth services, providing food, childcare, Aboriginal Head Start. And then in the early 2000s, the agency took on the child welfare mandate. 2004, we also became a children's aid society so that we could integrate all of those services. And so really our service model is we are trying to decolonize child welfare. There's that word again, recognizing that there is a colonial practice of child welfare, which has been so destructive to Indigenous families, and recognizing that the way to decolonize that, the way to change that, is to integrate very diverse, holistic, culturally grounded services into that model to create better outcomes for families.
So, again, we'll go to a practical example where a child has a very difficult circumstance, and for want of a better term, is in need of child welfare services, and needs to be removed from whatever setting it finds itself. So what is it? What's the essential difference between the way you would deal with a child that is in need of protection as opposed to a non-Indigenous child that is in need of protection?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, what a lot of the research and literature shows is that there is still a lot of systemic racism within child welfare, as there is within other professions and fields across Canada. And it shows us that social workers, particularly in mainstream agencies, treat Indigenous people and racialized people differently. There's a lot of stereotypes and inherent bias in that process, right? And that's led to a consistent overrepresentation of Indigenous kids. And so, how do we keep them together? How do we keep them together? How do we find opportunities to mitigate risk and keep families together? I mean, being driven towards achieving that in very concrete ways is one thing that makes us different. And this is not a Scarborough example, but I will turn to the fact that we opened Toronto's first healing lodge for Indigenous mothers and children last year, shortly before the pandemic, in downtown Toronto. And this is a house where, for the first time, if a mother is struggling with substance abuse and mental health issues that normally would result in her child being apprehended, she can go into this house, a beautiful old Victorian house, together with her child, a staffed house, and get healing and support in that house so that they stay together, right? They stay together. So we recognize that there's a lot of other options. We do a lot of in-home support. So if that risk, we feel like that risk can be mitigated by sending staff into the home 4 or 6 hours a day, that will also keep families together. And the site that you're referring to, the new site that we've just opened on Kingston Road, is an integrated team, right? So most mainstream children's aid societies just have social workers. They have teams that are composed of social workers, right? 8 social workers and a supervisor. What we have opened in our integrated location is a team that is not just composed of social workers. So we have what we call our child and family well-being workers, but we also have violence against women, anti-human trafficking, clinical workers, cultural supports. And so the whole case management process is not happening from a traditional social work lens. It's happening from a lens that includes a whole bunch of service providers that are sitting together and saying, what's the best thing for this family, for this child? How can we keep them together? How do we mitigate the risk while ensuring that they can stay together, right? And what we find, what our data shows, is that in many more instances, we're able to keep families together, right? Yes, it's true that in some cases we do need to do removals, but when that occurs, we minimize that time, and we also try to use kin placements and keep kids with extended family much more than other agencies do.
So that is if you will, the core difference between I'll pick on the Children's Aid Society and yourselves, which is that you want to you exercise a number of mitigating strategies before you actually go to if you will, the nuclear option of removing the child from its parents.
And we have more capacity to do that as a multi-service agency, right? Like the Children's Aid Society of Toronto, of course, tries to minimize removals as best they can, but they don't have as many internal resources to do that as we do, right? We can provide all of the other supports that I was just mentioning. Sometimes, you know what? Being a parent is hard. Being a single parent with intergenerational trauma is hard. We have found historically that one of the best mitigating factors to mediate risk in a home, sometimes it's Aboriginal Head Start program. Sometimes a mom just needs her little one to go to a safe place for 5 hours a day to get cultural support so she can have a break, do some laundry, do some grocery shopping, take care of her mental health, participate in some of her own programs, right? So having those multiple services available really do make a big difference.
Yeah. Now, Scarborough-Guildwood has the good fortune of, if you will, being Indigenous Central. Galway Road and Kingston Road is, if you will, the intersection of a lot of Indigenous services and places where Indigenous people live. So, give me an understanding of how your agency would reach into those various communities, because you would know where they are probably better than I would know where they are.
Yeah, so that we have had that that our Scarborough Child and Family Life Center has been there for quite some time. And just by virtue of being in the community as long as it has, we've developed a really good relationship with the families in and around that area. Gabriel Demont Housing is right there. Many of those families, walk across to our location. Their kids attend our daycare that's in that building, our Aboriginal Head Start, our before and after school programming, our summer camps. And so our philosophy really is to start relationships early and provide services to strengthen those families as best we can, and to be responsive to those families and understand where are the gaps, because there are still service gaps that need to be addressed. And when we develop new programs, we try to do them through community councils, to continue to provide needs that are unique to that community, if that makes sense, because there's so many different Indigenous communities across Toronto. They're not homogeneous. The needs are different in different areas.
Right.
And so we do take a very community-centered approach in our work in that neighborhood.
Do you involve yourselves, for instance, in the Eastview Public School Indigenous program there, or Laurier Collegiate's Indigenous program there as well?
We do. So we have native. We do have. We have our native learning centers that are part of the TDSB. We do the powwow at Eastview School. We've been doing on the land early on programming for families in that go to that school and parks in the area. So we certainly do assert ourselves in as much as the community would like, in those different areas. And I think the one thing that we're working on right now is, recognizing that this pandemic is having a massive impact on the mental health of families in that area. That self-isolation is creating a secondary pandemic of poverty and mental health, and in some cases, substance abuse and family violence. We are working with community to increase our mental health programming, and also hopefully develop a mobile mental health a crisis response unit that can do wellness checks and respond to mental health calls in place of the Toronto Police Service.
Yeah, it's quite ironic and distressingly ironic. It's two pandemics. There's a significant portion of the population is not being affected by this pandemic in the sense of declines in income and food insecurity and housing insecurity. And then there is a smaller percentage, but still a very significant percentage, that really is experiencing this pandemic in ways such as you described: mental health, food insecurity, and of course they all get interlinked. One leads to another, and then you've got real challenges.
Yeah. We never delivered food before the pandemic. We never delivered food. In April, we started developing a food hamper program. The families we were supporting didn't even have what they needed to self-isolate, right? You can't assume that somebody even has the resources to stay at home during a provincial lockdown. So we've delivered literally thousands of hampers since the pandemic began, something that we never had to do before. Yeah.
Well, thank you for talking to me for this past few minutes. The organization of Native Child and Family Services is a well-known and well-established. You will be an exemplary, in fact, you are an exemplary executive director of that organization. I'm very pleased that you've, if you will, moved into the neighborhood. I rather hope, and I do have an agenda here in the sense that I think it would be good for all of us to start to understand, and by that I mean, if you will, the non-Indigenous community, to understand not only what you do, but the nature, extent, and breadth of the Indigenous community particularly in Scarborough-Guildwood, but Scarborough generally, because it is a significant population, and in some measure operates as an isolated and independent population. So I appreciate you talking to me, Jeffrey. We've been doing this podcast on people who do extraordinary things, and you certainly are doing, you and your organization are doing extraordinary things, and I wish you every success, and certainly whatever help my office can provide you're you can just knock on the door. You can walk around the corner and knock on the door. So, well, I was going to say you can do that after the pandemic. Right now, you're going to have to phone like everyone else. So
Yeah.
again, thank you so much for talking to me.
It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. Chi miigwech.